It was a quiet February morning in Harrowfield. Mist hung low over the gardens, and inside a small red brick house, 3 identical 4-year-old boys played on the carpet, the Linton Triplets. Their mother stepped outside for just a moment to collect the washing. 10 seconds. When she turned back, the garden was silent. No boys. No footprints. No open gate. 3 children had vanished in broad daylight without a sound. For 30 years, the case remained frozen, until the day their mother noticed something so small, yet so impossible, it forced police to reopen everything. It was the 25th of February, 1981, a cold Wednesday morning, in the quiet market town of Harrowfield. One of those places where the countryside is close enough to smell, and London is just far enough to forget. Mist clung to the fields, hanging low, like it had nowhere else to be. The kind of morning where the world feels still, almost too still. Inside a small red brick house on Millstone Lane, the kettle was beginning to whistle. Margaret Linton, just 29, moved between the kitchen and the sitting room with the soft, practiced rhythm of someone who has lived this morning 100 times before. On the carpet sat 3 toddlers, all in matching knitted jumpers. The Linton Triplets. Oliver, Samuel, Peter. To most people, they were identical. Blonde hair, round cheeks, those bright, curious eyes. But to Margaret, they were 3 different worlds. Oliver, brave. Samuel, gentle. Peter, always thinking, always watching. They were everything she had. Everything she loved. The smell of buttered toast drifted through the house. Birds chattered outside. And for a moment, just a moment, life felt perfect. A moment Margaret would replay for 30 years. Trying to understand when the nightmare began. Because nothing, absolutely nothing, about that morning felt wrong. Not the laughter. Not the spilled milk. Not even the soft knock at the door. Just after 9:30. Margaret opened it, still drying a plate with her apron. Mrs. Holloway stood there, the neighbor from across the road. Friendly, chatty, the kind of woman who always knew something. Before anyone else did. "I'm heading into town," she said. "Do you need anything?" Margaret smiled. "No, we're fine. Thank you." She didn't realize it then. But that was the last normal conversation she'd have for a very, very long time. The boys were out in the garden. A small space, fenced, safe. She checked it twice every morning. She filled the kettle again, looked through the window, and saw them running around the apple tree. 3 little jackets bouncing like bright spots of color. It should have been safe. It had always been safe. Just after 10? Margaret stepped outside to collect the washing. 10 seconds there, 10 seconds back. But in those 20 seconds, her world changed. When she turned, her heart stopped. The garden was empty. No Oliver. No Samuel. No Peter. The apple tree stood still. The red ball sat untouched in the grass. At first, she thought they were hiding. A childish game. "Boys? Come on, where are you?" No giggles. No movement. Nothing. Her voice sharpened. "Oliver? Sam? Petey?" Silence. The kind of silence that sinks straight into your bones. The kind that tells a mother, something is wrong. She searched the garden. Called their names until her voice cracked. Checked the shed, the alley, the front room. Everywhere. Nothing. She went door to door, barefoot, shaking, asking neighbors if they'd seen them. No, love. Not today. In 15 minutes, panic. In 30, fear. By 11, the quiet little town of Harrowfield was no longer quiet at all. 3 children had vanished. In broad daylight. Without a sound. Without a struggle. Without a single witness. People ran into the streets. Shops closed. Volunteers lined the pavements. Search parties formed. The fence wasn't broken. The gate was shut. There were no footprints in the soil. It was as if the boys had simply faded out of the world. Police arrived. Officers went house to house. They questioned drivers, neighbors, shopkeepers. Someone thought they'd heard a car engine rev. Someone else mentioned a delivery van they didn't recognize. But no detail led anywhere. Nothing connected. As officers searched the garden, Margaret sat on the back step, shaking. Hands squeezed together, desperate. She could still picture them. Running. Laughing. Alive. How could 3 little boys vanish in seconds? No screams. No signs of struggle. No open gate. Just, gone. By afternoon, helicopters circled overhead. Riverbeds were searched. Woodlands combed by 200 volunteers. But again, nothing. That evening, national radio picked it up. Harrowfield, 3 4-year-old triplets missing. Search efforts underway. Margaret didn't sleep that night. Or the next. Or the one after that. As minutes turned into hours. Hours into days. And days into the longest week of her life? Her world, once filled with 3 tiny jumpers and 3 tiny pairs of shoes, collapsed. This was only the beginning. Because the truth behind what happened that morning in 1981 would stay hidden, buried, for 30 long years. Until Margaret noticed something. Something small. Something strange. Something no one had ever paid attention to. And that tiny detail reopened the entire case. What followed shattered everything she thought she knew. For weeks, Harefield lived in a state of fear. Police officers stood on every corner. Parents held their children closer. Doors that were once never locked stayed bolted day and night. The Linton Triplets' faces were everywhere. Posters on lampposts. Flyers in shop windows. Newspaper headlines that looked too heavy for the paper they were printed on. But for every lead, there was another dead end. Detectives interviewed more than 300 people. Searched every river, every ditch, every abandoned farm building within 10 miles. Nothing. No clothing. No footprints. No sightings. It was as if the boys had stepped out of the world and taken the explanation with them. Margaret barely spoke. She barely ate. Her days blurred into one long stretch of waiting. Waiting for a phone call? A knock on the door? Any sign that her children were still somewhere she could reach. The police weren't unkind. But over time, their confidence faded. Their visits became shorter. Their updates became fewer. And their words became softer. The kind of softness people use when they've run out of hope, but don't want to say it aloud. 6 months passed. Then a year. And slowly, painfully, the case slipped from headlines. Then from conversation. Then from people's memories. But not Margaret's. Never Margaret's. She kept the boys' room exactly as it was. 3 little beds. 3 little pillows. 3 small jumpers folded neatly at the end. She sat on the edge of their beds most nights, telling them stories they weren't there to hear. Apologizing for things she couldn't change. Praying for things she knew were impossible. And then, life carried her forward. But never away. 30 years passed. Seasons changed. Neighbors grew old or moved away. The apple tree in the garden grew thicker, heavier. Its branches reaching toward the house. Like it remembered something too. And Margaret, now older, quieter, slower, lived in that same small red brick house on Millstone Lane. The world outside had changed beyond recognition. But inside, her world remained frozen in 1981. Then, one evening, late autumn, Margaret was sorting through an old box of photographs. Not because she wanted to, but because sometimes grief pulls you back to the smallest, simplest memories. When you least expect it. She picked up a picture of the boys in the garden. All 3 standing beneath the apple tree. She smiled sadly. Then she looked closer. Squinting. Something in the corner of the photo caught her eye. A shadow. A shape. Something she had never noticed. She brought the photograph closer to the lamp. Adjusted her glasses. And then, her breath caught in her throat. Because what she saw wasn't a trick of the light. Wasn't a smudge on the print. It was real. And it didn't belong there. A figure. Standing at the far edge of the fence. Blurred. But undeniably there. Watching the boys. A figure no one had ever mentioned. A figure no one had ever investigated. A figure that shouldn't have been in the garden at all. Margaret felt her chest tighten. The room seemed to tilt. For 30 years, she had stared at this photograph. Without seeing this. But now she couldn't look away. She knew what she had to do. She picked up the phone, hands trembling, and called the police. When the detective on the other end answered, Margaret spoke 6 words. That reopened a case the world had forgotten. I found something you need to see. When detectives arrived at Margaret's house the next morning, they didn't expect much. Cold cases rarely surprise anyone anymore. 30 years is a long time. Too long. But the photograph changed everything. The officers laid it flat on the dining table. The same table where the triplets once scattered toys and crumbs. They used a magnifier. Then a digital scan. Then enhanced it on a laptop. Slowly, the blurred shape sharpened. Not enough to reveal a face. But enough to confirm a presence. A man. Tall. Motionless. Standing by the back fence. Watching the boys. Detectives exchanged looks. The kind of look that says, we missed something. All of us. The photograph went straight to the cold case unit in London. Within days, officers were in Harefield again. Asking questions that hadn't been asked in decades. Revisiting statements. Rechecking addresses. Old neighbors were interviewed. Former shopkeepers. Anyone alive who might remember 1981. But memory is a fragile thing. It bends. It blurs. It chooses what to keep. And what to quietly let slip away. Some remembered seeing a delivery van that week. Some thought they'd noticed a stranger walking along Millstone Lane. Some weren't sure if they remembered it, or if they'd simply convinced themselves they did. Nothing solid. Nothing usable. The officers widened the search. Old case files were digitized. Aerial maps from the 80s were compared with modern layouts. Archaeologists and forensic analysts were consulted. Every inch of the Linton property was scanned with new technology. Ground-penetrating radar. Thermal imaging. Drones. But the ground told no story. No shallow graves. No disturbed soil. No hidden evidence. It was as clean and silent as the day the boys disappeared. Weeks passed. Then months. Then a full year. Still nothing. For the police, the case was becoming another cycle of hope and disappointment. But for Margaret, the photograph meant everything. It was proof. Not of what happened. But that something happened. Something real. Something the world had overlooked. And that belief carried her through the loneliness of the investigation. One morning, a detective phoned. A new one. Younger, persistent, unafraid of cold trails. He said a name. A former resident on Millstone Lane. A man who moved away in 1982, just months after the disappearance. He had no criminal record. No reports. Just an odd piece of history. He worked part-time at a repair shop. That serviced delivery vans. The same type that several neighbors vaguely remembered. It wasn't evidence. It wasn't even a lead. It was a thread. But sometimes, a thread is all you need to pull an entire story loose. Detectives tracked him to a seaside town in Devon. He lived quietly. Alone. Kept to himself. When interviewed, he insisted he remembered nothing. Said he didn't even live near children that year. Said he'd never seen the triplets. But when detectives showed him the enhanced photograph, something shifted in his eyes. A flicker. A pause. Just long enough for trained officers to notice. He asked for a moment. Then said he had to leave. Then claimed he felt unwell. Moments later, he shut the door. Detectives exchanged glances. They sensed it. The tremor of truth buried somewhere beneath decades of silence. But when they returned the next day, he was gone. Left his flat. Left his belongings. Left without explanation. All that remained was a single map. On his kitchen table. Folded neatly. Marked with a small blue dot. A place on the outskirts of Hereford. A place no one had searched in 1981. A reservoir. Long since drained. Flooded again. Then expanded in the early 2000s. A place the triplets might have never gone to alone. A place no one had connected to the case. Until now. And for the first time in 30 years? The investigation had a destination. A place to look. A place where answers might finally be waiting. The news of the reservoir sent a shock through Margaret's world. For 30 years she had lived in a house filled with echoes. Echoes of small footsteps. Echoes of laughter that once ricocheted off the walls. Echoes of a life that paused on one February morning and never resumed. Now, suddenly, there was movement again. A direction. A place that might hold the truth. But truth, Margaret had learned, is never gentle. Not after this long. Detectives arranged for her to stay with her sister while the search began. She sat by the window of the guest room, hands wrapped around a mug of cooling tea, eyes fixed on the gray sky. Every few minutes, she whispered the same words under her breath. Let me be strong. Just this once. Let me be strong. Down in Hereford, the reservoir grounds were closed off. Police set markers along the perimeter. Geologists and sonar specialists brought equipment. Officers looked drained. As if the weight of 3 decades had settled on their shoulders overnight. People in town whispered. Some said it was pointless. Some said it was deserved. Some said hope was cruel, after all this time. And yet, people gathered along the road. Quiet. Respectful. Waiting. Because after 30 years, this wasn't just a family story. It was Hereford's story. A wound the town had never fully healed from. Margaret didn't go to the site. Not at first. She couldn't. The memories were already loud enough. The way the boys giggled when they ran across the grass. The way Oliver tried to climb the apple tree. The way Samuel cried if he fell. The way Peter always looked as if he was thinking far beyond his years. Every night, she dreamt of them. But never the way they were. Always the same scene. 3 small shadows running just out of reach. Always out of reach. One evening, about 2 weeks into the search, detectives visited her. They didn't bring news. Just caution. The reservoir bed was layered with years of silt and debris. Even if something had been there, it might not have survived. Time erases more gently than water. But it still erases. She nodded. She already knew. Around this time, a letter arrived. No sender. No name. Just a shaky handwritten envelope addressed to her. Inside was a single sentence. "I'm sorry for the boys." No explanation. No signature. Nothing else. Detectives analyzed it. No fingerprints. No useful markings. No match in handwriting databases. But something about the curve of the letters felt familiar. Uncomfortably familiar. Margaret put the letter in her drawer. She told no one how her hands shook when she folded it. How her breath caught. How she stared at the paper until the words blurred. Days stretched into weeks. Then into months. The search slowed. Rain made the ground unstable. Funding dipped. The team rotated. But Margaret waited. Every day. Every hour. She waited. In her quiet moments, she spoke to her boys as if they were still curled on the living room floor. Sometimes she laughed at the memory of their faces, their tiny arguments, their matching outfits she knitted by hand. But more often, she cried. Quietly. Softly. The way someone cries who has learned to carry grief like an extra limb. Her son, the eldest she never mentions in public, visited often. He was a baby when the triplets vanished, too young to remember them, but old enough now to understand the legacy of loss. He sat beside her with gentle patience. "Do you want to talk about Dad?" he'd ask. "Not today," she'd reply. Because the story of the boys was only half the story. Their father left a year after they disappeared. Some break quickly. Others break slowly. But everyone breaks eventually. Margaret learned to live alone. Not by choice. But by necessity. 30 years is a long time to wait for a knock at the door. A phone call. A discovery. Anything. And then, one morning, just as dawn touched the horizon, her phone rang. A detective. His voice steady, but thick with something unspoken. "Mrs. Linton, we need you to come to the reservoir." Her breath caught. Her heart pressed hard against her ribs. She knew. Before he even explained. She knew. The past, after 3 decades of silence, was about to resurface. And whatever waited in that reservoir would change everything. The police car was already waiting when she stepped outside. Cold air clung to her coat. The kind that settles deep in the chest, as if preparing you for something heavy. The drive to the reservoir felt unreal. Trees blurred past the window. Fields flashed by in muted shades of green. Margaret sat still, hands folded tightly in her lap. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. When they arrived, the atmosphere was different. Somber. Structured. As if the ground itself understood the weight of what had been found. Blue tarps lined the shoreline. Officers stood in quiet rows. A forensic tent had been raised near the shallow basin. Rain clouds pressed low above the water, turning everything gray, as if the world had paused to match her heart. A detective she recognized, one who had worked the case for years, stepped forward gently. "Mrs. Linton, we've recovered remains." For a moment, her ears rang. A pressure pulsed behind her eyes. The world dimmed, not fading to black, but softening, as if reality had become too bright to look at directly. She nodded once. A small, almost imperceptible gesture. "I'd like to see," she whispered. They led her closer. Slowly. Inside the tent, the smell of damp earth filled the air. Forensic technicians moved with quiet precision. Careful hands. Soft voices. Respect embedded in every action. What lay before her was not horror. Not shock. Just silence. Fragments of tiny shoes. Colors long faded. But shapes still heartbreakingly familiar. 3. Side by side. One blue. One red. One green. The colors she always used so she could tell them apart at a glance. Margaret pressed a hand to her mouth. A single sound escaped her. Not a cry. Not a gasp. But something in between. A sound a mother makes when her heart remembers and breaks at the same time. A small, worn metal badge was recovered too. A tiny star-shaped pin Oliver took from the toy box and insisted on wearing everywhere. He called it his super badge. Said it made him brave. 30 years underwater? Yet still shining faintly through the dirt. It was enough. Enough for identification. Enough for truth. Enough for closure. Later, forensic teams explained the likely scenario. A sinkhole. Small, then sudden. Opening beneath the old maintenance patch near the fence. The boys must have stepped on unstable soil. The ground gave way silently. The collapse swallowed them instantly. No noise. No struggle. No sign left above. A tragedy hidden in plain sight. A mother blamed herself for decades? For something no one on earth could have predicted. As Margaret stood before the calm waterline, rain began to fall. Soft. Steady. Almost gentle. She didn't cry. Not then. Her tears had been spent in another lifetime. Instead she whispered, "I've got you now." The triplets were laid to rest the following week. A quiet service. No press. No crowds. Just family, standing beneath a pale morning sky. 3 small headstones, side by side, engraved with their names and the same line beneath each one. Loved beyond time. For the first time in 30 years, Margaret slept. Not well. Not peacefully. But without waking every hour. Listening for footsteps that would never come. In Hereford, people spoke differently after that. Not with fear. Not with speculation. But with a kind of reverence. The reservoir path now holds a small plaque. In memory of Oliver, Samuel and Peter Linton. Lost, but never forgotten. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, locals say they see something by the water. 3 small shapes running along the edge. Laughing. Playing. Just as they once did. Shadows of childhood. That the town refuses to let disappear. Margaret visits every Sunday. She lays 3 flowers. Yellow, blue, and white. And sits on the bench overlooking the water. Not in grief anymore. But in connection. In presence. In something that feels softer than pain. And stronger than memory. As she once said to a reporter, softly, they were never really gone. Just waiting to be found. And now, they have been.